Hello folks, welcome to another Darktable Landscapes video. In this one we're going to be looking at one of Darktable's most powerful and useful tools, which is masking. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing to realise when you're masking things in Darktable is that there's no separate masking section. Each module has its own masking tools dedicated to that module at the bottom of each module panel. So here's the exposure module masking tools. If I go to, say, sigmoid, it's got its own tools there. And so the masks are discrete to each module. What I'm going to do is go through a few photos with some common use cases for mainly landscape and nature, but the principles will apply to pretty much any genre of photography. Obviously, Darktable doesn't know what kind of photo it's looking at. I'll go through a few photos, a few examples of kind of common masking practices with landscape and nature photos, and then you can practice those yourself with whatever genre you've got in mind. And we're going to start with a very simple one, really, and a very common one, which is how to mask a sky. In this case, I want to make this sky darker. So because the masking tools are per module as opposed to in a separate kind of zone, if you like, as say Lightroom is, the first decision you have to make is what do you actually want to alter. In this case, we want to alter the exposure, so I'm going to use the exposure module. So I've already got the default here. I'm going to duplicate that with a right click. So now I've got a fresh exposure module, and I'm going to go to the masking tools along the bottom, and we'll start with parametric masking. Draw masking is simpler, but kind of perhaps used less. I will come to that later on in a separate photo. So I'm going to click the parametric mask tool, which is this one here. And although parametric sounds kind of vaguely scientific and nerdy, it just means that we're going to be using some parameter of the image to make a mask. Okay, so we've decided we want to make a mask using an exposure module. So we've made that decision. The next decision to make is what parameter to use to make our mask. Sometimes it's blindingly obvious, maybe it's color or brightness, sometimes it's not so clear. But to help you make the decision, there's a quick tip, and that's to hover over the slider here, the value selector, and press the C key. And that will kind of preview the channel that you're going to be using. So we can see here this G is the gray values, which is essentially the brightness. And so we can kind of see that while the sky itself is quite bright, we'd probably be able to make a good selection on that. The clouds are maybe about the same brightness as the foreground kind of here. And so will probably not be ideal for making a good mask. So now we'll check the red channel. Again, we've kind of got some similar reds in the foreground as in the clouds. Let's try green. And let's try blue. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. You can see that there aren't many of the blues in these clouds down here in the foreground. So it's often the case with skies. It's obviously the sky is blue, the light coming from the sky is blue because it's shining through water and Rayleigh scattering and all those kind of things. But it's quite often that you'll get a good selection for a sky using the blue channel here. So let's give this a go. There's a few ways we can do this. We can turn on the mask preview, which is this button here. And you can see that our image has turned entirely yellow. Yellow is the color that Darktable uses to show you the mask. And at the moment, our entire image is selected because we haven't changed anything in our slider here. The range is wide open, which means everything is selected. Okay, so there's a few ways we can do this. We can turn on our mask preview and then drag up our sliders. And now what we're essentially doing is filtering out anything to the other side of these sliders. So anything in the dark blue tones here is being filtered out. And as we're going for the sky, that's kind of the natural place to start. Filter out the darker tones, which is the foreground. And we can do the same thing at the other end, which is the brighter end. And that's going to be removing light tones from our mask, from our selection, which obviously we don't want to do in this case because we want to select the sky. So let's drag that back. Now you can see here that the sliders split. And what that allows us to do is kind of blur the range of values that the mask is selecting. So you can see here that we're starting to get into the lighter tones already. We don't want to do that. We want to pull it back. Let's go right back until we get a nice selection on the sky, but nothing else. So that's one way of doing it. Let's go there. I think we've probably not dragged. There we go. So we can drag back just to give a little bit of feather. We don't want to select any of the mountains here. We can see we've just got a little bit creeping in, but we can sort that out. So there we go. That's one way of making a selection, just by dragging that manually. The other way, if I reset, and that's this button here to reset the mask. The other way we can do it is using the color dropper tools here. So this will just select a single point, whereas this one with a little plus will allow us to select a range of values. So if I just turn the mask preview off, whoops, I'm clicking in and out. So let me select a block of sky and then turn our mask preview back on. And you can see that it's already kind of made a pretty good stab at the values that we want to include. Sometimes this is a quicker way of doing it than fiddling around with sliders here. So you can see this has basically set our sliders for us, and it's done a reasonably good job. Now we've got a slightly kind of jagged line here. You can see it's kind of aliased as opposed to anti-aliased, if you like. So we have a couple of ways of getting around that. If we go down underneath our slider here, we've got a few controls, and ones we use the most are probably feathering radius and blurring radius. Feathering is a little like blurring, but what it actually does is it kind of spreads out the mask to push it into areas where there's a transition. So it's quite good if you're using a drawn mask, say, or a mask that's not quite conforming to where you want. You can increase the feathering, and it will try and push the mask into areas that you want it to go in. So it kind of has the effect of softening a selection as it's kind of pushing in. You can see here, if I zoom into the image itself and just go down and adjust the feathering, you can see how it's smoothing it out without blurring it as such. If I go to blurring, that will just blur. That will soften the transition quite a lot. You can see how now the mask is bleeding over. Sometimes that's desirable. It depends. We've got quite a sharply defined sky here. There's no kind of mist dragging over the mountains. So, we're quite lucky in this shot. It's almost like I chose it on purpose. So we don't really need to do much blurring on this. We can give a little bit just for a nice natural transition. I'll do a little bit there, and that's fine. And for a nice clean sky foreground separation that we've got here, that's pretty much all we need to do. Now we've done the masking, we can just adjust our actual module controls. So I want to make this slightly darker, and you can see if I go way over the top, you can see how our selection is just kept nicely to the sky. So let's do a more natural adjustment. There we go. And you can use this little eye tool here to actually turn the mask on and off. So that's what it would do without the mask. We're affecting the whole image essentially. And that's what it's doing with the mask. And we can turn the module itself off to see the effect. Okay, so we've darkened the sky and we've got a fairly natural transition. It's not glaringly obvious that the sky wasn't like that in the original shot. Now it also stands to reason that because we've got a reasonably good selection of our sky, we should be able to get a reasonably good selection of the foreground. Now we could use the same process as we've done there by selecting colours or brightness values and so on and so forth, but our foreground is much more complicated in terms of those things than our sky is. We've got various reds and hues and greens, gradations of shade and so on and so forth. But what we can do, now we've got a selection of the sky, is just simply invert the polarity of the mask. So down here in the masking tools, next to the slider is this little plus minus, and you can see if we hover it, it says toggle polarity, best seen by enabling display mask, which we've got on already. This is display mask. So if I just click that little plus, we've essentially inverted the selection. So now we're no longer selecting the sky, now we're selecting the foreground. So if you wanted to do any adjustments on the foreground and the sky is an easier selection, you can just select the sky and flip it round, and voila, you've got your foreground selected very quickly. Okay, let's look at a slightly more complicated mask now. This is a shot taken at Conic Hill on Loch Lomond, and it's a slightly more complicated mask. You can see we've got some clouds over the hills. There was a bank of snow moving in from the north, and it started to snow on me about 10 minutes after this shot was taken, and that's going to make things slightly trickier. You can see there's kind of this line between the sky and the foreground, the mountains, is less well defined. So let's, for the sake of argument, say that we just want to alter the exposure of this again. So we'll use another exposure module. And it doesn't matter what module you're using really, the controls for the masking in the parametric way are the same. So don't worry too much about the fact that I'm just kind of using exposure again. We'll go over some different options later on. So let's go for parametric masking, and as we've already used the blue channel and we know that works quite well for skies, let's check that one first. The more you use it, the more you'll kind of know what you'll be able to get a selection from quite easily. That's not too bad. We've got some separation between the sky and the hills with the blue channel. So let's give that a go, and let's go straight to our picker and turn our mask preview on. So we're starting to get a selection. The sky is less well differentiated even within itself. So you can see here that our blue is kind of really bleeding into the mountains, and as we're also selecting the same tone in the water. And I'll go over a way we can kind of mitigate that if we want to. Maybe we want to adjust both at the same time. But the first thing we're going to do is make sure we get a better selection in the first place. So we've already got a selection with the blue channel, but we've got other channels we can look at. I don't think any of the color or value channels are going to be a great deal of help to us. Let's turn the mask preview off again so we can see what we're doing. That's not too bad, but we've got this gray elsewhere in the image. Now we have a few other kind of slightly weird looking channels here in the JZ, JZ, CZ and HZ. And these are brightness in a different color space, chromaticity, which is essentially the saturation of color, and HZ is the hue, so selecting by color. So let's have a look at what we can do with these. I zoom my screen back out, and let's have a look what we get with JZ. Whoops, I've zoomed in again. This is essentially brightness, so that's not too bad, but again we've got a very bright sky and a very bright loch, so maybe not too great. How about saturation? Now that's not too bad. We can see some real difference here between these parts especially, and then we've also got HZ, which is color, and that's not too bad either. So you can see that the hills are orange, but the sky is pink and indigo, purple, but we do get some bleed over into this mountain here. So let's have a think. I think probably HZ is our best bet. So let's grab the same tool again, and we'll try the same area as well and see how that's affected our mask. That's not bad at all. You see how it's kind of gone around the mountain much more now. Make sure we're selecting everything. You can still see it's still kind of speckled in here. So let's see what we can do about that. First thing we can do is feather. We'll kind of fill in some nooks and crannies and a little bit of blur. There we go. And we can also adjust the mask contrast, so the difference in values between the most transparent and most opaque parts of the mask. And now that's not a bad selection at all. We can clearly see the hills aren't selected. Maybe these ones here, but that's okay because this is cloud and this hill is less selected. So I'm quite happy with that. Let's see what we can do in terms of the actual adjustment. Don't want to go too crazy with this one because it's quite a nice sky as it is. We can either go much brighter if we want to kind of reduce emphasis, or pull out some detail by darkening. Let's just say about there. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So again, for the sake of argument, as you can see, we're also affecting the light in the loch here. Let's say that we didn't want to do that. We in fact wanted to leave the loch alone and just adjust the sky. So for that, we can switch from our parametric mask to a drawn and parametric mask. And this lets us combine the parametric masking with the drawn masking tools. I'll go into the drawn masking tool into more detail at the end. So let's have a look at our preview again. So here's our selection, okay? And what we really want to do is say, don't select any of this. We want to exclude this. We just want our mask to apply here. Now in this case, we're relatively lucky because there's a nice kind of straight zone with no selected area at all. So the quickest way we can do this is to use a gradient. So I'll click the gradient button over here with our selection tools. So we've got circles, ellipses, drawn shapes, brushes, and gradients. So I'm going to use a gradient, Here's my gradient tool on the map itself, on the photo itself. So I'm just going to click, and you can see that basically what this is doing is saying where it's drawn and where those parameters apply the mask. Okay, if I drag this down, you'll see that it's starting to include that again. And the same gradient tools apply that we can always use. So we can do shift and roll the mouse wheel over the central point to choose adjust the feathering of the gradient. So we can make that quite tight. We can drag this handle here to tilt the gradient if we really want to, though we don't want to in this case, of course. And we can roll the mouse wheel to curve the gradient if we want to. So that's one way of doing it with a gradient, but there's other ways. We can use a different shape. If you want to remove a shape, we'll right click. We can also do a drawn shape. So let's say drawn. We could just draw a box or a shape around this area. And you'll see that this is done the opposite of what we want. In fact, it said just select this and not this. So to change that, we can just flip the polarity of this drawn mask. So that's this minus here. So at the moment it's minus. We'll flip it to plus. And essentially what we've said there is use the parameters, but exclude everything inside this area here. And as always, we can shift and roll to bring in that feathering, or roll itself just to adjust the mask shape. And we can pull in handles to refine it. So that's a way of kind of refining. If you've got, say, some snow on the mountains and you've selected the sky, which is bright, and the snow is a similar brightness, you can just kind of draw around the snow with this tool and snip it out of the selection. So now if we turn our mask preview off, and we'll click our mask view button there as well, which is that little cursor with a line, so we don't see the mask itself. So now we can see that we're just affecting the sky. Okay, let's look at another example. Before we do, if you're enjoying the video, please do like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps me out. But let's have a look at this otter. Long-time viewers will probably recognize him. I've got a few videos where he features. So let's say I've processed this photo as much as I want to. I've got the exposure correct. I'm happy with the finished result, but I just want to sharpen things up. Now, obviously our main aim with masking is only affect regions that we want to affect, and normally that's to emphasize those regions. So here I really want to sharpen the otter, but I don't particularly want to sharpen the lawn that it sat on. There's no particular appeal there. So the first thing I need to do is essentially sharpen the whole image, and then we'll limit the sharpening just to the otter. So let's go for diffuse and sharpen, and we will use the no AA filter preset in this case, and we've got sharpening across our whole image. Okay, so now we want to choose how we're going to mask it. So the obvious differentiator between the otter and the lawn is the color. So the otter is brown and orange, the lawn is green and yellow. So let's check out the HZ channel in the parametric masks. If I press C, we can see that really bears out. We do have a little patch of kind of slightly yellow here under his chin, where the kind of the color of the grass may be reflecting a little bit up into him. But let's see how we can select this. So turn on mask preview, and we know for a certain fact that we want to exclude the greens and yellows. So let's pull those down so that we're excluding them, and there we immediately see the difference. Okay, so we're really just selecting the otter. And I don't think we really gain much by pulling up this end, because these are the kind of the browny warm tones that make up the otter's fur. So this is our main problem area here, where the colour underneath the otter's chin here is kind of getting similar to the grass. So let's pull this bottom slider back just to smooth out that transition. There we go. You can see that we're starting to get a little bit of selection from here. Let's not do too much of that. Let's see, get as much as we can just here. Okay, so now we need to kind of fill in the blanks, if you like, fill in these bits that have not been selected for one reason or another. Let's see how just feathering will help us out. Not a great deal. A little bit of blur. Let's increase our mask contrast. Now we're kind of selecting more of the selected parts, but deselecting more of the deselected parts. So that's not ideal either. So the first thing we can do is maybe refine our color selection. So let's see what the picker can do for us. Make sure we include that area. There we go. Now we're getting a slightly better color selection. This is one of the areas where this picker can work better than just your kind of eye can. So that's not bad at all. But we do have a selection up here in the corner of the grass and around here. So let's use a drawn on parametric mask this time. So we'll just switch over to that. We'll grab our shape tool, just do a very rough shape around the otter. We can go off the edge of the canvas, that's no problem. Right click, and just leaving it at the default polarity, which is minus, we can exclude the selection outside. So we can refine this mask a little bit. We're not worried too much if there's a little bit of grass that gets sharpened, you know what I mean? We don't have to be too precise with this kind of thing. And I'll show you how to be more precise with your draw masks in the next example. But for now, that's a pretty good job. We'll just pull in everything that we can, but we're not going to be too worried if it sharpens a little bit of slightly bokeh grass. So we'll turn our preview off, turn that off, and now we can see that whereas before we were sharpening the whole image, obviously it's fairly subtle when you're talking about sharpening, now we are just sharpening the otter. So I normally do a kind of a two-pass sharpening approach, one the no AA filter, and then I will also do a lens deblur. So let's do another instance of diffuse or sharpen. Let's make it lens deblur, say medium, just to sharpen the otter up a little bit more. And now we don't have to kind of go through that whole masking process again. We can make use of another of the masking tools, which is this one here, raster mask. And if I click on that and go to the raster mask drop down where it says no mask used, I click that down and it will give me a list of all the other masks I've used in my image that can apply to this module. In this case, I've only used one, which is on the other diffuse or sharpen module. So I'll click that and then it will apply the same mask to that module as the first module. So now we've kind of just replicated that mask very quickly. Now we're applying just that sharpening on this module as well, just to the otter, without having to do everything a second time. So if I zoom out, we can see that the otter is nice and sharp and the grass is not. Okay, now for our final example, which is a red deer from the Highlands. And this is quite a challenge for a parametric mask. Red deer have evolved in Northern Europe to blend into the environment of Northern Europe. So you can see that if I happen to just grab an exposure module here and just go for a parametric mask just to see what we're looking at, we can see the deer is pretty much the same brightness as the background. It's the same red tone as the background. It's the same green tone as the background, the same blues as the background. It's about as bright. It's about as saturated as the background. And it's almost even the same color as the background. It's just evolved to blend in. Okay, so it's fairly obvious that we can't use a parametric mask in this case. There's just no parameter that sufficiently separates the deer from the background. So we're going to have to rely on just a drawn mask for this one. And I'm not going to do it with exposure. I'm going to do it with sharpening again because the exposure's fine as it is, although we could do a little bit of both. Let's do diffuse and sharpen first for the sake of argument. And we'll do the same as we did with the otter, no AA filter. And now it's sharpening, let's up the iterations a little bit. Now it's sharpening everything, which we don't want. It increases noise and it doesn't emphasize the deer like we want to. So let's use just a drawn mask in this case. So that's this little pencil icon. If I scroll down, you can see that we've got none of the parametric tools there at all. We do have our usual options from the drawn and parametric mask tool that we've seen a couple of times now. Circle, ellipse, drawn path, brush, and gradient. I tend not to use brush much. It's kind of messy. I don't like it. I prefer to be a little bit more precise using the path tool. So let's show you how my process goes with that. So what I normally do is do a reasonably rough mask at this kind of fit to screen zoom level where I can see the whole subject. And then I'll zoom in and I'll refine it further in a little bit more detail so that I'm selecting just the thing I want to select to a reasonable degree. Before I do that, which we'll do by clicking a path and then clicking on the image, as you've seen in other examples, you can see that that kind of grey line is a little bit hard to see. So I'm going to get rid of this one. And now the only way I know how to do this is by going to the crop tool. If you know any other way, please do let me know in the comments. I'm going to change the colour of the masking shape tool. So I'm going to go to crop. I'm going to click this grid. You can see here we've got overlay color gray and contrast 0.5. Now you can choose different colors here. I'm going to choose cyan. And you can see here with the crop tool, it's showing me that the line's going to be cyan. But if I go back to diffuse and sharpen, there we go. And I go to my draw mask tools again and I click a path. Now when I click my path in here, you can see that this path is also cyan. I don't think it's part of the main settings. So that's how I do it. It will remember it for next time, but just so you know how to do it from scratch. So I'm just going to click a rough mask around here. You can see it kind of gives me a curved line by default. If I ever want to do a sharp line, I can hold the control key and then it will do angled lines, as you can see here. So I'll do a couple of sharper lines here around the legs. Right, it's a little bit trickier. That should be okay. I'll do a sharp line here. Again, not worrying kind of too much about super precision because I'm going to be refining this in a moment, but we don't want to add points where we don't need them. We can always add and take away after the fact. So I'm just going fairly quickly, go up into the legs here. That's a bit rough. Around the rump, follow the curve of the back, around the ear, up around this antler. And then to finish, right click. Okay, so now we can see with our nice cyan lines that we've got a reasonably rough outline of the deer. And then the dotted line is the kind of the feathering effect. So if I pop on the preview, you can see this is where the mask starts and it fades out towards the dotted line. We can adjust both those lines separately if we want to. So we can adjust the feathering per point if we want to. Now I'm going to go in, I'm going to turn my mask preview off, I'm going to zoom in and adjust this path to make it more precise. Now, by default, certainly if you've got your mouse inside the mask and you roll the wheel, what it in fact does is sizes the mask itself. I'm not sure when that's ever really useful, but there we go, that's how it's programmed. So to avoid that, we can hold the A key, and then when we roll our mouse wheel, we are zooming the whole photo, which is a bit more logical. And the same thing, we can hold A and click and drag our photo around. And now we can refine our mask. So we can drag points in that. And I'm using Darktable 5, the new version, and one of the new version's features is that we have these double handles here. I'll zoom in even further on the screen itself. Double handles around each control point, so you can drag, that changes the angle of the curve. And you can also hold shift and just control one handle at a time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hold control, click to add a point, drag it in, and then I'm going to hold shift and just adjust this curve. Maybe hold shift again there. So we can really fine tune this as much as we want. Now we're using a fairly subtle module, which is sharpening. So the kind of the effect of the sharpening will be fairly hard to judge. You can kind of see it when I'm zooming in here, but kind of at normal viewing distances, sharpening is a fairly subtle effect. So I'm not going to go right up and really refine it. You can do, if your subject requires it, say something like a car with very kind of hard edges, maybe you could do that with, but I'm not going to be too precise. I'm just going to be more precise than I am in that first pass. Now, if I drag this point up, you can see, ideally I'd like to snug it right up under the ear here, but I don't have the point for that. So I'm going to, again, control click and add a point. That lets me curve it around the ear. Dragging this one, hug it closer to the cheek. I imagine this kind of process is also quite handy for portraits as well, but I don't do much portraiture, if at all, any at all. So we'll just tidy this up around the legs now. Okay, kind of crossed over a little bit here. We could probably do another point here, I would think. So let's put a point on the knee there, drag that one in, another point here. Probably need another point in here as well, just to follow the leg better, the back leg. And another one. We went really sloppy here, so we'll refine that off. fact, we've crossed over, so let's pull those the right way around. There we go. Pull this one down as well. Maybe add another point there to improve the curve. A and drag yet again. I'm just going to zoom out so you can see more or less what I'm seeing. I'll control click and add another curve around the back side here. Sorry, I've bound a zoom button to my mouse, and it's a little bit hypersensitive. I keep on catching it, but at least you can see things in more detail. Just occasionally I don't realise I zoomed in. There we go. Pull those into the ear a little bit. Snug that down to the antler. Control click, pull it in. We need a few more points here actually, because we want to wrap it around this tine of the antler here. Antler even. There we go. Okay, so now we've got a much more precise mask, and if we turn on the preview, we can see we have a pretty good deer shape. We are still selecting some of the background. We can further refine that with the details threshold slider. So this is one we haven't looked at yet, but what this allows you to do is kind of adjust the mask based on how detailed the area is. So if you drag it to the left, it will tend to select less detailed things. If you drag it to the right, it will select more detailed things. Now, one of the reasons I have taken a while to do a masking tutorial is because this slider used to kill my PC. So if you have an older GPU, you may find this slider doesn't agree with your computer. It used to just crash Darktable for me. Now I have a better GPU, I can use this. And it's not a deal breaker. You can still get away in almost every case with the existing tools, the other tools, but it can just help sometimes. You can see in this case, it's not far into the detailed end of things that it starts to deselect even parts of the deer. But we can kind of start to remove a little bit here from the outside. And we probably need to do a little bit of feathering, a little bit of blurring. We could maybe reduce mask contrast in this case, just to really blur it off a little bit. We can hold shift and roll, and then we can start to really blur the effect itself. So we probably want a nice smooth transition between sharp and soft, just to kind of almost mimic the depth of field of the photo itself. I'll probably reduce the feather a little bit actually. Perhaps even reduce the mask opacity. There we go. So now we're just sharpening our deer. And again, we can do the same thing. We can duplicate our diffuse and sharpen, go down to raster mask. And before we do that, actually, we need to set the preset because presets don't have any masks applied. So if you do the mask and then apply the preset, you'll wipe out your mask. So we'll do lens deblur medium. We can see our deer's got sharper, and then we'll mask it off so we're not sharpening everything else. So we have one on exposure, but we want the diffuser sharpen mask. There we go. And now we're just masking that. And then we can do maybe a simple draw mask to do a bit of a vignette around the deer itself. So let's duplicate exposure. We'll do a drawn mask. We can do maybe an ellipse. Depends how elliptical your deer is, I suppose. We'll roll the mouse wheel out while holding shift just to give it a good feather. And you've seen me do this hundreds of times before, I'm sure, or at least a dozen or so times in the rest of my videos. So at the moment, the mask is selecting inside the circle. We want to invert that, so we'll reverse the polarity of the mask. And you can see my vignetting is way too strong. So we'll just reduce the actual exposure adjustment itself and really feather it off. So now we're really focusing our attention on the foreground deer as opposed to his mates in the background. Okay, so there are 4 sharpened images. I hope you've found the video useful. I tend to go kind of fast and loose, whereas other YouTubers will tend to go in a little bit more detail. So if you don't already, do check out Boris Ajdukovic's videos on masking. I think he takes 3 videos to go over the same tools that I kind of rushed through in half an hour or so. But he goes into much more detail and probably explains things considerably better in terms of the technical side of things, if nothing else. But this should give you the kind of the basics to play around with your own images and start making selections and masks and start just kind of applying adjustments in a slightly more refined and targeted way. So again, I hope you enjoyed it. Do like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.